Welcome to the Rise to Intimacy podcast. I'm your host, Valerie McDonald, and for over a decade, I've worked as a sex and couples therapist because intimacy used to feel really overwhelming for me. I felt a lot of pressure to perform, I was disconnected from my body, and I often felt like desire was out of reach for me. But through my own trauma work, I stopped checking out of my body and started feeling connected to it again. I learned what it's like to experience intimacy without fear, without shutting down, and without numbing out. Now I'm on a mission to help you do the same thing. This podcast exists because trauma doesn't get the last word. You can learn how to calm your body, change the story you've been carrying, and rebuild real connection. First with yourself and then with the people you love. Let's begin. If you're the one who always initiates sex in your relationship, you're probably struggling with feelings of rejection and may even be wondering if your partner's just not that into you. And it can also feel confusing, because unless you're a rock star at communication, you may be dealing with these feelings all alone. So you eventually stop initiating altogether, or you feel guilty every time you do, because the rejection becomes too painful to keep risking feeling that way. And that's what I'm going to discuss in today's episode. Now, if you're the other partner, the one who's been saying no, or who's been avoiding initiation, this episode is also for you. Because I promise, what's happening underneath this is typically not what your partner thinks it is. And understanding that distinction is the first step to changing this pattern. In episode 7, I talked about the pursuit-withdrawal cycle, how one partner reaches for emotional connection while the other pulls away. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, I encourage you to check it out because it's one of the top things I help couples with who work with me. That episode focused on the emotional version of what I'm discussing today. But in today's episode, I'm going to talk about the sexual component of that cycle. Because for many couples, there is an entirely separate pursue-withdrawal dynamic at play when it comes to physical intimacy. And it's usually painful for both partners. At the end of the episode, I'm going to give you 4 strategies you can use to start breaking this pattern. But before we get into it, I want to provide a brief disclaimer. If you're the partner who typically says no to sex or who doesn't initiate, I want you to know that this episode is not about telling you that you're the problem. Your body's responses and your boundaries are valid, and nothing I say here should ever be used as a reason for you to feel pressured into sex. This episode is for couples where both partners genuinely want to be intimate with each other, but they become stuck in a pattern that's keeping them disconnected. It's not about one person being right and the other being wrong. It's about 2 people who are both hurting in different ways and can't see each other's pain clearly enough to repair what's happening. If sex isn't happening in your relationship because of active abuse, an unresolved betrayal, or because you've truly fallen out of love, that's not what we're talking about today. But if you're stuck in a cycle where one of you keeps reaching for physical intimacy and the other keeps pulling away, then keep listening. The sexual version of the pursue-withdrawal cycle is when one partner initiates sex more frequently, typically because sex is their primary way of feeling connected to and reassured by their partner. So we'll call this person the sexual pursuer. When this happens, the other partner can feel pressured by how frequently sex is being initiated, especially if they're not in the mood or because they identify as having low desire compared to their partner's level of desire. So they end up declining sex more often than accepting it. And over time, they experience their partner's desire as a demand, not as an invitation for connection. So we'll call this person the one who withdraws from sex, because saying withdrawer in my southern accent simply just doesn't sound great. Now, when this cycle happens, both partners may be experiencing feelings of resentment or lack of love in the relationship, ultimately leading to less satisfaction overall. And eventually, these feelings will bleed into all forms of closeness, like casual affection or even how you sit next to each other on the couch. So it isn't just about sex. It's about what sex represents, which, for most couples, is the most vulnerable form of connection that exists. Just like the dynamic that shows up in the emotional pursue-withdrawal cycle, the sexual pursuer is reaching for connection, and they're wondering if their partner still wants them and finds them desirable. Now, the partner who withdraws sexually starts pulling back even more as a result of these increased advances, but it's not because they don't love their partner. It's because the pressure around sex has become so loaded with expectation and potential disappointment that their nervous system registers it as a threat rather than a bid for connection. And as I've talked about previously, saying no to sex is often your body protecting you, not rejecting your partner. Now, what I haven't talked about is what happens on the other side, to the person who keeps feeling rejected. Both experiences are valid and both need to be understood if you're going to break this cycle. What's important to understand is that research consistently finds that sexual rejection affects more than a person's desire for sex. Over time, it can affect relationship satisfaction, feelings of closeness, self-esteem, and even how secure someone feels in the relationship. And that doesn't mean anyone should agree to sex they don't want. It simply means that repeated rejection often carries emotional meaning that extends far beyond the physical act itself. Now, in a lot of couples, these roles aren't fixed. They can switch depending on whether we're talking about the emotional space or the sexual space. This is something that colleagues and therapists in this field are seeing consistently, and it's one of the most confusing dynamics a couple can be trapped in. So it looks like this. One partner is the emotional pursuer. They want more conversation, more quality time, more verbal affirmation. But sexually, they may be the one who rarely initiates, and eventually, they may start avoiding physical intimacy altogether. Now, the other partner is the one who withdraws emotionally. They tend to shut down during conflict and avoid deep emotional conversation. But sexually, they may also be the one who's reaching out. They may initiate frequently and then start tracking when sex last happened, and they feel rejected when it doesn't happen. So now each person feels like the pursuer and the one who withdraws at the same time, and each person experiences rejection. And neither one can see the full picture because they're only focused on when they feel the most hurt. Research indicates that when a therapist addresses only the emotional cycle first, it can actually make things worse because it overlooks the sexual pursuer's primary way of connecting. If the partners whose main language of connection is physical intimacy and they don't feel like that's being acknowledged, they often disengage from the emotional work entirely. And then the couple stays stuck in this dynamic. And that is why I believe that both cycles need to be named and addressed together in therapy. The partner who says no to sex is experiencing a nervous system that doesn't feel safe. And they may also be dealing with responsive desire, meaning their desire for sex typically surfaces after they feel emotionally connected, but not before. But the nervous system feeling unsafe is also at play in the person who pursues sex. This is because the part of your brain that manages pain also gets triggered when someone you love says no to you. Your brain does not distinguish between physical pain and the pain of being rejected. So rejection doesn't just feel like it hurts. It actually hurts because your body processes it the same way. And when that happens for months or years, your brain starts to develop what researchers call anticipatory anxiety. You're not just reacting to the rejection anymore, you're bracing for it before it even happens. And this is the exact same thing I described in a previous episode on performance anxiety, where I talked about how the brain rehearses failure before sex even starts. In this situation, your body remembers every time you reached out for your partner and they turned away. And eventually, the experience stops being about a single rejection. What's particularly important here is that researchers have found that the pain isn't necessarily coming from the rejection itself. It's often coming from what the rejected partner begins to believe about the rejection. Over time, many people stop hearing, "I don't want sex right now," and start hearing, "I don't want you." And that's very different messaging. When someone repeatedly interprets rejection through that lens, it can ultimately decrease their overall satisfaction in the relationship. So they're no longer simply responding to disappointment, but instead, they begin to start scanning for signs that another rejection is coming. They become more hesitant to initiate, more sensitive to changes in affection, and more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as signs that something is wrong. And this is because their nervous system has learned to expect pain. And your brain will always prioritize avoiding pain over seeking pleasure. But the desire doesn't just disappear. Instead, it gets stuffed down inside. One study that measured the effects of sexual satisfaction on couples found that sexual satisfaction lasted for 24 hours after a sexual advance was made and accepted. But this study also found the sexual dissatisfaction lasted for up to 48 hours after a sexual advance was made and then rejected. Now, the research doesn't suggest that healthy couples never say no to sex. Every healthy relationship includes moments when one partner isn't interested. The difference is whether the rejected partner leaves that interaction feeling unwanted or simply disappointed. Those are two very different experiences. One creates temporary frustration. The other creates a wound that tends to accumulate over time. And that accumulation is often why couples tell me it's not really about the sex anymore, because eventually the pain becomes less about physical intimacy and more about feeling unseen, unwanted, or emotionally alone. When the sexual pursuer finally stops initiating, fights surrounding sex usually stop too. And then the tension around sex seems to lift. And for a moment, it can feel like relief for both partners. But what ends up happening is you quietly stop being vulnerable with each other in a place where vulnerability must exist. And because the arguments surrounding sex finally stop, it can temporarily feel like the problem has been resolved. But the absence of fighting is not the same thing as the presence of connection. And the partner who stops initiating sex starts pulling away from other important moments of connection too. They may stop flirting with you or saying the things that used to make you laugh. Unfortunately, couples typically wait an average of 3 years before seeking therapy for relationship challenges. But this waiting period only makes the sexual pursue-withdrawal pattern more rigid and harder to shift. The longer you and your partner spend waiting for something to change, the longer your body has to learn that the relationship is not a safe place to let your guard down. And the longer that goes unchallenged, the deeper it settles in, and it then becomes a permanent way of being with each other. This is also the phase where I see one or both partners begin to invest their emotional energy elsewhere. And I don't just mean through infidelity. In fact, I don't really mean through infidelity at all. But it can be through friendships, through work, through your kids, or through scrolling on your phone at night instead of connecting with your partner. But as a result, the relationship becomes a logistical partnership rather than an intimate one. The sexual cycle and the emotional cycle of the pursue-withdrawal cycle we're talking about, they tend to feed each other in a way that makes both worse over time. And this is why this pattern can feel so impossible to escape. So this is what it looks like for many couples. One partner says, I need to feel emotionally connected to you before I want to have sex. And the other partner says, sex is how I feel emotionally connected to you. So neither one is wrong, but together they create a dynamic where one partner won't have sex until they feel emotionally close, and the other partner doesn't feel emotionally close without sex. So then each partner waits for the other to initiate first, but neither one makes a move, and then the gap widens. Okay, so now let me give you some specific strategies you can use to break this cycle. And these are all designed to be practiced together as a couple. So in an earlier episode, I recommended that couples give their emotional cycle a name. That way you can say, I think we're stuck in this cycle, instead of blaming each other. So I want you to do the same thing with the sexual cycle, but give it a different name, because these are two separate patterns and your nervous system needs to understand that. The point is that you bring awareness to the cycle being the problem and not each other. Most couples have never named their sexual dynamic out loud. They felt it and they thought about it, but they've never directly confronted it. Right now, most couples dealing with this cycle, every form of physical touch has become loaded. So any type of touch, even a hand on the back or cuddling on the couch, can cause the person who tends to withdraw wonder, is this leading somewhere? Are they going to want sex? And the moment those thoughts begin, their nervous system lights up because they're unsure what that touch is asking for. And when that happens, they start feeling the type of pressure that prevents them from being present and prevents them from feeling comfortable to engage in even non-sexual physical affection. And for the pursuing partner, they start noticing their partner tensing up in these moments. So they stop reaching out for non-sexual touch too. So the second strategy is to discuss upfront your intention around physical affection when it happens. And if you know your partner gets anxious around touch, let them know you want to connect with them with no expectations around this touch leading to sex. This will help you to rebuild your nervous system's association between touch and safety. So it might look like holding hands during a walk or sitting close enough on the couch that your legs are touching, or even taking a shower together with no expectations attached. For the partner who withdraws, this removes the pressure that has been making all touch feel like a demand. And for the partner who pursues, it allows them to experience physical closeness without the risk of sexual rejection. So if you've listened to my previous episode on orgasms, you'll recognize that this is very similar to the sensate focus exercise I use with couples, which was developed by Masters and Johnson specifically for performance anxiety. The principle is the same here. Remove the goal of sex and orgasm, and the nervous system relaxes. And when the nervous system relaxes, connection becomes possible again. So the next strategy is especially important for the partner who tends to withdraw from sex. One of the biggest misconceptions I see in couples is the belief that if you have the right to say no to sex, then your partner shouldn't have any feelings about that no. But those are actually two separate things. You absolutely have the right to decline sex. And your partner may still feel disappointed, hurt, rejected, or disconnected afterward. Research on sexual rejection found that the biggest predictor of distress wasn't simply whether someone heard no. It was how that no was experienced. When people felt dismissed, criticized, ignored, or shut out, they reported significantly lower relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction. But when partners communicated with warmth, affection, reassurance, or appreciation while declining sex, the negative effects were dramatically reduced. In other words, the difference isn't necessarily between saying yes or no. The difference is whether your partner still feels wanted and reassured of your love when you say no. And for the partner who's declining sex, this often reduces pressure too, because they no longer feel responsible for carrying their partner's entire emotional reaction alone. Because for many people, especially those who tend to pursue sex, the question underneath the initiation isn't, will you have sex with me? It's, do you still want me and find me attractive? And are we okay? And if those questions go unanswered often enough, rejection starts to feel less like an isolated moment and more like evidence of something bigger. This is why repeated sexual rejection can become so painful. And if you've been listening closely, you'll recognize that this is exactly what we talked about earlier in the episode. Over time, repeated rejection can teach someone's nervous system to expect pain before they even initiate. And that is why reassurance matters so much. Reassurance doesn't mean forcing yourself to have sex when you don't want to. It means helping your partner understand that your lack of desire in this moment is not the same thing as a lack of love, attraction, or care for them. So you can say something like, I'm not up for sex right now, but I would love to cuddle with you and spend some quality time together. In a previous episode, I talked about asking your partner what emotional connection means to them, because so many couples use that phrase without knowing what it actually looks like for their partner. So this next strategy is about doing the same thing, but for sex. And this conversation needs to happen when you're not about to have sex or when you just finished. And definitely not at 11 p.m., y'all, when you're both exhausted. You should do this at a time when both of you are regulated and calm. So here are some good questions you can ask each other. When you think about our sex life, what do you love the most? What does sex give you that nothing else in our relationship does? What would help you feel safe enough to initiate? When was the last time you felt genuinely desired by me? And what other feelings other than desire did you experience when that happened? These questions are designed to get underneath the behavior and discover more about each other's attachment needs. Because the sexual pursuer wants to know if you still value them for other things besides support with the household duties, helping financially, or caretaking. And they also want to know, of course, if you still find them desirable. And the person who tends to withdraw from sex needs their partner to know they need to feel safe before they can enter the vulnerable space where sex occurs. So using these questions will help you get to the underlying messages underneath your pain, and this alone can promote more connection. Because when couples stay focused on the behavior itself, they usually stay stuck. One partner focuses on how often sex is happening, and the other focuses on how much pressure they're feeling. But when you understand the need underneath the behavior, you stop fighting the symptom and start addressing the real problem. So if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's episode, it's this. Most sexual pursue-withdrawal cycles are not created by one partner wanting too much sex or the other partner wanting too little. They're created when two people become trapped in a pattern where one person's attempt to seek connection unintentionally creates pressure, and the other person's attempt to reduce pressure unintentionally creates disconnection. Both people are trying to protect themselves, but unfortunately, the strategies they're using are pushing them further apart. So I hope this episode not only helps you better understand this cycle, but also know that whether or not you're the person who pursues or withdraws, neither one of those experiences is wrong. They're simply ways you're showing up in your relationship right now. I hope the strategies I provided can be useful to you to help you start changing this cycle. But it won't change by waiting or only reading more about it or listening to more podcasts on it. It changes when both of you are willing to do something that feels risky, even if it's imperfectly at first. And if you want help with this, head over to reasetointimacy.com and book a consultation with me. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to the Rise to Intimacy podcast. If today's episode resonated with you, know that healing is possible and you don't have to do it alone. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a rating and review for us at ratethispodcast.com/rise. It really helps others find us, and I'm so grateful for all your support. You can learn more about my coaching packages for individuals and couples at risetointimacy.com. And remember, sex therapy isn't for people who are broken. It's for people brave enough to look beneath the surface.